In finishing up our discussion on culture, this section we're going to look at the differences in many different dimensions of culture, if you will. So we're going to look at it, but one of the things that I want you to think about is to consider how culture influences our behaviors. I mean, some of this stuff is talked about, some of it is in the book, but just from yourselves, look at how you are influenced by culture. Look at maybe some of your friends that might share a different culture than you, how they're influenced by their cultures. Perhaps the foremost authority on culture, and speaking from a perspective of culture as intercultural differences, is most likely going to be Gert Hofstede. Now, Hofstede has spent his career looking at different cultural elements, and he started to analyze what these differences meant by putting together all of the information that he could muster with some primary research of actually going to these cultures, doing a lot of survey research, interviewing a lot of people to basically understand differences in cultures. Now, according to Hofstede, culture is the collective programming of the mind which distinguishes the members of one group from another. And according to Hofstede, these differences are based on different dimensions. In its most simple of terms, cultural dimensions, according to Hofstede, come to us from the aspect of how people perceive differences on these 6 dimensions: indulgence versus restraint, long-term versus short-term orientation, masculinity versus femininity in a cultural aspect, a tolerance for uncertainty, one's individuality, and also the element of power distance. So we're going to look at each one of these in turn. Now, when we look at individualism, we look at this from 2 different perspectives. One, again, from the aspect of individualism, which is the extent to which people are expected to take care of themselves and primarily their immediate families. But in some societies, in some cultures, they share a more collectivism aspect. Here, it's where the individual's life is intertwined with a larger collective group. So part of it has to do with, do we look at it from an aspect of I or the perspective of we? In an individualistic society, people really, as it says, only take care of themselves or look after themselves and their direct family. Where other families or other aspects look at it from the big collectivism of we as a group. Now, part of this can be seen in this area. One of the most talked about aspects of Chinese society is the aspect of guanxi, which basically describes a personal connection between 2 people or 2 organizations, in which one is able to prevail upon another to perform some type of favor or service, or conversely, to be prevailed upon. Now, the thing is that these 2 people do not need to be equal social status for this to be used. One of the things that I saw about this has to do with my in-laws. Now, my mother-in-law and my father-in-law, of course, still live in China, and they are in their 80s and having a little difficulty sometimes, especially my mother-in-law, getting around. Now, my wife has 2 sisters, and all 3 of the kids live somewhere else, so nobody's close to home. But because of the connections that they have built out over their lives and their careers, that they have friends who will check in and they will take her mom to the doctor or help their mom in some type of way that is needed. And it's not because, okay, you know, they're really doing this because they really like the mother-in-law. I'm sure that they do, but it's a matter of, you know, they've helped each other in the past, and this is just one of the things that they do. Now, one of the things that I experienced in this is that several years ago, we took in a foreign exchange student in high school for a year. And this young man happened to be from my wife's hometown. He stayed with us a year, graduated high school in America. And, you know, I mean, I tried to, you know, teach him how to drive a car, and I gave him spending money and all this stuff. Because again, it was kind of the aspect of, he's just a poor college student or poor high school student from China. And when he graduated, he said that his father is going to come over from China to watch him graduate. And when he got there and my wife started communicating with the father, it turned out that the father owned like 13 or 14 car dealerships in China, and by all standards would be considered a Chinese billionaire. The man had considerable amounts of money and showered it upon my children, which was nice. But when we've gone back to China, whenever we've needed anything, this aspect of guanxi kicks in because he will send a driver for us for the entire time that we're there. We need to go somewhere, his driver will chauffeur us around. So again, it's just basically this aspect of relationships and how they're built together. The next dimension, according to Hofstede, is basically the aspect of, is the culture masculine or is it feminine? Now, a high score on the masculine scale indicates that society is basically driven by competition, achievement, and success, with success being defined by the winner or best in field aspect. The value system here starts in childhood and continues throughout one's life, both in work and leisure pursuits. A low score, which indicates femininity on this dimension, means that the dominant values in society are caring for others and the quality of life. A feminine society is one where quality of life is the sign of success, and standing out from the crowd is not admirable. So again, the thing is that this fundamental issue here is what motivates people. Do they want to be the best, which in regard is the masculine side, or enjoying what they're doing, which is the feminine side? Power distance, on the other hand, is the extent to which authority and privileges are divided among different groups within society, and also the extent to which these facts of life are accepted by members of society. The fact that everybody is unique implies that we are all unequal, if you think about it. One of the most salient aspects of inequality is the degree of power each person exerts or can exert over other people. Power also can be defined as the degree to which a person is able to influence other people's ideas and their behaviors. Now, this dimension deals with the fact that all individuals in society are not equal, and it expresses the attitude of the culture toward these power inequalities amongst us. Power, then, is how we basically can look at what the hierarchy is. In some cultures, it's a very flat hierarchy, where in others, it's a very structured hierarchy. The dimension uncertainty avoidance has to do with the way that a society deals with the fact that the future can never be known. Should we try to control the future or just let it happen? This ambiguity brings with it anxiety, and different cultures have learned to deal with this anxiety in different ways. And the extent to which the members of a culture feel threatened by ambiguous or unknown situations and have created beliefs and institutions to try to avoid these is reflected in the score of uncertainty avoidance. The long-term orientation dimension describes how every society has to maintain some links with its own past while dealing with the challenges of the present and future. And societies prioritize these two existential goals differently. Normative societies, which score low on this dimension, for example, prefer to maintain time-honored traditions and norms while viewing societal changes with suspicion. But those with a culture who score high on this dimension, they take a more pragmatic approach. They encourage thrift and efforts in modern education as a way to prepare for the future. Now, we see this oftentimes. One of the things that stood out with me from this long-term orientation is that there was a study done many years ago where they went to managers in the US and Europe and Asia, and they asked them, what is your definition of long-term? What's long-term planning? In the Western culture, that long-term planning was about 3.5 years. But in the Asian culture, many of the Confucian cultures, Confucian cultures, I guess you would say better, is that long-term planning edged up close to about 30 years. So that's a big gap in understanding how we think about long-term and how we plan. A pragmatist considers thoughts, or our brains basically, as instruments or tools for prediction, problem solving, and action. On the other side, a normative outlook, such as what we experience here in the US, makes consumers a little bit more impatient. And oftentimes, if we look at it from a definitional standpoint, it's basically how comfortable that a society is with the idea that not everything can be explained. We here in the US like to understand things, but we also realize that it can't be. And so sometimes that makes us a little antsy. One challenge that confronts humanity, now and also in the past, is the degree to which small children are socialized. I mean, without socialization, we do not really become human. This dimension is defined as the extent to which people try to control their desires and impulses. And it's kind of based on the way that we're raised. A tendency to a relatively weak control over their impulses is called indulgence, whereas a relatively strong control over their urges is called restraint. Cultures are defined and can fall into the category of either indulgent or restraint. So this is basically the different dimensions that Hofstede basically looked at. So now let's look at some examples of this. Now this table basically shows the results of some of the research from Hofstede that he has done with a host of countries. And what he basically has created is basically a scorecard on the various countries on the various dimensions that are out there. So some of these, for example, if you look at power distance. Now, for example, in Russia, the power distance, their score is 93. Where in the United States, in the UK, it's pretty low. What this basically looks at is that, for example, here in the US, it would not be uncommon for a boss and one of his workers to socialize. But in Russia, this would never happen. It just would not be possible. The other aspect, if you look at it from an aspect of individualism, and again, we looked at individualism as, do I think about I or do I think about we? Well, high individual countries, such as the United States, Australia, and the UK, it's more about, hey, I'm going to take care of me and I'm going to look after me and my family. Whereas in a collectivistic society, such as that of China and Pakistan, it's more of a collective we that we look after. And again, you can go through and you can see the differences between the various countries. Now, one of the things, if you look at, for example, with Pakistan, I've got, there's basically zeros for long-term orientation and indulgence. Well, Hofstede had a very difficult time collecting any type of information on these two dimensions within that country. So again, it's just a matter of understanding the differences. And the thing is that the differences that they're ingrained with us from our cultures have to be taken into account, especially when we're trying to manage and operate in an international arena. Now, in this same vein, when we think about culture, we have to understand a couple of other concepts. The first, ethnocentrism. And this is basically the belief that one's own culture or ethnic group is superior to all others. Now, it doesn't mean that you're being biased or racist in that regard. It's just that oftentimes, for example, if you look at many of the cultures, think about when you think about wine, when you think about fashion, when you think about automobiles, when you think about different elements, oftentimes certain countries pop into our head. Well, oftentimes though, when inside a particular culture, they will think that the way that they do something is going to be superior. So oftentimes it can get to the extreme when it comes into bias or racism, but for the most part, it's basically that, I think that, the way I do things is a little bit better than everybody else. And it's one of those, it's a hard thing to understand. Because if you look at how you do something, if you don't think it's better, why do it? So how do we learn about culture? Of course, part of it's going to be socialization, being around others, being involved in that culture, and also, you know, being ingrained in it, where we come from with the acculturation aspect. So how do we gain, and who can gain easily? For example, if you wanted to move to another country where you're going to have to experience another culture, what could ease it? What could make it easier? Who's going to have an easier task at it? And these are what we have to understand, especially when we're looking again at international business, because today managers, if you want to move up the ladder into a vice president area, I guess, then you are going to most likely do an international stint at some point. And it's great experience. It's a great experience not only from your business perspective, but also in your life as well. So if you get the opportunity, take it. So, who acculturates well? Well, females. Those that are younger, those that have low ethnocentrism scores, and low ethnic identities. Who takes a little bit longer? Older males with high ethnocentricity and high ethnic identities. And of course that makes, you know, very good sense. Because again, if I have high ethnocentrism, boy, that one's a tongue twister, I just may not want to accept anything else that's out there because I think my ways might be the best way. So again, oftentimes we learn ways to ease people into a new culture. And part of it's the language, but part of it is also the customs that they invoke. But there are other ways that we learn culture, of course, from school. For example, lower classmen may follow the study habits of upper classmen. If Thursday night is party night, chances are you're not going to study then. You learn that as a freshman, and it kind of continues on. Your family is a way of learning about cultures and different behaviors that we have. We observe our parents, and we learn to behave in certain circumstances. Through the church we learn, through our media we learn. Everything that we see around us is some way that we're going to learn about how things are supposed to be in our environment, which is our culture. Now the last thing I want to discuss is basically the aspect of globalization. And this is basically, oftentimes when brands want to go international, they want to carry everything with them from their home country. They want to take the same package, the same product, the same advertising, everything. But that doesn't always work. Now, oftentimes we have to adapt to the local environment. And that's kind of where globalization comes in. So basically what it means is that, yes, I can be global, but oftentimes the tactics I'm going to use are going to have to be local. So again, we have to think about it. How is the local environment that we want to enter into going to react to my message, to my brand, to my flavors? For example, if you travel in many parts of the world, some of the products that you eat here are going to be very different. For example, I know that just from my experience in China, Kentucky Fried Chicken, which is probably the most successful American franchise in China, their chicken sandwiches are very spicy, which are very good actually, but it's very different. Other things, Oreos are different in China, so is many of the other brands that we basically grow to love. So that's the end of the lecture for this week, but again, I got a couple of things to finish up with. All right, so this week you have your third exam. There will not be a quiz this week, so I'm just going to focus on the exam for you. And next week we're going to start on our last module, looking at the decision-making process, which I think is probably one of the most important elements that we'll cover in consumer behavior this semester. Have a great week.